Yeah, this is a great opportunity. There's a great partnership between South Africa and Germany, and therefore I'm looking forward to interactions with the Foreign Office, with the Chancellery, with political parties that are fighting in a global war against populism, and even to understand Germany's own integration of the economy. So I'm certainly looking forward to the trip, and it is very, very cold, but I'm certainly excited about the opportunity to meet people all over the world who are standing for leadership and values.
We have to work with each other. We have to be critical about the results of the last 50, 60 years of the way we conceived Africa and the way we conceived how it should develop. In a very much, I think, Eurocentric way.
I thought it was a very good engagement, looking at what Germany's relations are with Africa, the common interest that we all share, the interest around moving Africa away from aid to trade, and how it's always helpful that when you invest in trade, you can then begin to address some of the developmental questions that are taking place in Africa. The idea around security, and security is now becoming a geopolitical issue, and so Germany's interests in many of the African states, but also how we have to play a crucial role in ensuring that democracy and institutional democracy functions. And that's why even our plea is always to ensure that in African states there's always free and fair elections, that no one abuses power post taking over power, that institutions of the state remain in place. And then lastly, the idea of immigration, how it impacts the relations now in Europe, and what it's doing for us as a country in South Africa is something that we need to learn about. How do we ensure that citizens are properly looked after, properly registered, and that we can give legal certainty to anyone who is immigrating, whether here in South Africa or in Germany. I think one of the things that we're looking at, certainly at the FOCAC discussion, how do we, in the forum and the Partnership for Africa, how do we enhance trade? How do we, there was a good discussion about setting up a fund that will help micro-enterprise go into Africa and certain key countries, and how to do trade there. How do we go about the reassurance around certain policies like expropriation without compensation? So as things stand at the moment, I think the common themes are how do we direct investment into Africa, and what does Africa need to do? And certainly some of the things that I'm taking away is how do we ensure that there's policy certainty? How do we ensure that when we discuss development, in fact we're meaning trade, not aid? And furthermore, how do we ensure without doubt that the bilateral relations, certainly amongst countries, expand further to mean city-to-city partnerships, that we can achieve the aid of small businesses being able to come in.
Increasingly shocked by the findings of an official inquiry into corruption allegations against former President Jacob Zuma. The so-called state capture scandal centers around the Guptas. All right, well, here with me in the studio to talk about South Africa, where it's headed, and the potential leadership role he could play in it, I'd like to welcome Mmusi Maimane, the leader of South Africa's biggest opposition party, the Democratic Alliance. A very good evening, sir. It's good to have you here in person. Contextualize this for us. I mean, today South Africa is the wealthiest and most unequal society in Africa. How big of a problem is corruption in your country?
Look, I think corruption is a massive issue. It's, as the conservative estimate of 6.2 billion rands. But what I think corruption in South Africa indicates is that it's become a systemic thing. Every contract that is conceived in South Africa by the state has elements of corruption in it. It's almost as though, as former President of South Africa described it, he said, every project that is built with corruption in mind. And therefore, it means that the resources of the states have been stolen. Many South Africans are left unemployed as a result of it. And naturally, I think that it indicates of the fact that the ANC as a ruling party has become a party that is suffering from the cancer of corruption that has taken over every sector of society.
All right.
Offices of the FTP and the Liberal Political Party that is here to speak to a number of media about the very crucial subject of freedom. We live in a world where freedoms of individuals are being undermined. We have a confusion, as President Macron so well put it, of what does nationalism mean vis-a-vis what is patriotism. We're living in a world where freedoms are taken for granted, the freedom of the press, to be able to report and to give accurate information, the freedom of people to move. These things are now being taken for granted. And therefore, I'm really looking forward to advancing the cause of freedom all over the world. Because as in Africa, we've seen how many dictators rise, they undermine democratic institutions, they capture the state. We must continue to fight for freedom.
Tell me something, please, about the domestic situation in South Africa, if you don't have any questions about the German situation. I appreciate Mmusi's visit to Berlin. I know him for quite some years. He's a very strong personality, a leader, and we have a close connection between the Free Democrats in Germany and the Democratic Alliance in South Africa. Both of us, we have the same challenges: nationalism, populism, and we share the same values. We want to strengthen individuals, we want a good progress for our societies, we want civil rights and strong economies, and this is why we have decided to work, to cooperate together in the next years, even closer than in the past.
Mmusi Maimane, es ist uns eine große, große Ehre, Sie heute Abend hier als unseren Gast begrüßen zu können. Herzlichen Dank.
I think we find ourselves at a very historic time in the world. We find ourselves in a space where we have to make some serious choices about the road ahead. South Africa is not in a unique position. As much as Germany and South Africa might find themselves in world apart, I do think we face similar choices in some ways. And South Africa's journey is not only crucial for what happens in the country itself, but it's also going to be important for what happens in the continent. I really believe that, without doubt, the choices that we make at next year's election, as the topic of discussion today, will have profound impact on the 57 million South Africans who call that part of the world home. I don't ever want to claim to speak on behalf of 1.2 billion Africans, but I know for a fact that our economic output, our economic influence, is going to be crucial for the continent of Africa. And whatever South Africa chooses to do is going to be important about grasping the opportunities that present before it, and certainly for those who are around. If you don't mind, I'll address you as Democrats, as people who hold the principle that democracy is the way forward. Because without doubt, I certainly hold this principle, that Africa's development is dependent on the strengthening of its democratic outputs. I stand before you and address you as someone who believes in this continent. We've seen various economist titles that speak about whether Africa is rising or whether Africa is the dark continent. I actually hold the optimism about Africa. And therefore, our partnership here today with the German Africa Foundation remains absolutely important, that we strengthen democratic institutions in Africa. And we see a development of Africa that moves away from a continent in need of aid, but rather a continent that must shift towards trade. And part of my message here has been, how do we begin that? In South Africa alone, our greatest crisis is the fact that of every 10 adults, 4 work, and 4 out of every 10 adults don't work. Unemployment in our country is our most crucial challenge. And so if we're going to begin, we have to understand indeed that we do face a crisis, with the majority of those being young people, and whatever response we put forward has to address the economic challenges of South Africa. But before I get to our economic development plan, let me perhaps focus a little bit on what the state of democracy is and where we are. Because I, like many others, grew up in a community of Soweto. I love Soweto because Soweto has produced many great leaders, many great sons of the continent, one of them being Nelson Mandela. And so it's always great to have come from a community such as that. But I can recall, like a child, watching in 1990 as the world was undergoing its own transition. Here in the world, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall in South Africa, the release of Nelson Mandela, the beginning of a journey towards freedom. We began a beautiful story. We were all told as Africans that indeed now is the beginning of a new liberation era. And liberation movements all across the continent look still today to what the ANC has done. But fellow citizens and Democrats, I think it would be amiss to say, let us remain in a space where we stand only for liberation movements. As historic and as powerful as that moment is, we need to enter an era of post-liberation movement era in South Africa. Because like my Kenyan friends constantly remind me, that at first you must be liberated, and then you must liberate yourself from the liberators. Democrats, in a post-liberation era democracy, we have to ensure that we strengthen our institutions. One of the things that have taken place in the last 10 years of ANC government is that we've seen the destruction of institutions, the deployment of people into those key institutions that simply are no longer loyal to the constitution of the republic, but rather to the party. We've seen how our foreign policy has allowed ourselves, even now as we hold a very key position in the UN Security Council, that we need to use that position as an opportunity for us to reject dictators and to uphold democratic values. We should no longer. Because if the debate just becomes about replacing one form of nationalism for another, then there isn't really a debate tonight. When we look at next year's elections, we might as well say, what nationalist movement will come through? For South Africa's history is one of colonialism, apartheid, and a different form of nationalism. If that is the revolving door we must go through, then we don't have a debate to go on. But I would argue the case that actually what we need more than anything is a change. And it's that type of change that I want to speak to you about. It's a change that breaks down walls. It's a change that focuses ourselves on an inclusive economy for all our people. And like you've done it here, in the breakdown of the wall between East and West, South Africa needs to break down the wall between black and white, between those who are left out and those who are on the inside, to build an economy for all. To achieve this, we must put forward compelling arguments that speak to citizens and show our people that we are a party that is focused on the future. I'm strong on a tomorrow for all the people, and I believe if the D8 does not succeed, South Africa cannot survive a one-party dictatorship. It requires change. Change is what strengthens democracy, and I really believe that I hope you can be partners of Africa as we seek to build an Africa that is developing, that is more inclusive for all of its citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you.